The old house, its weathered clapboard siding and broad porch worn by time, seemed alive with stories untold. Each groan of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind weaving through the eaves, carried the echoes of long-forgotten laughter, shared secrets, and now, a silence so heavy it felt deafening. Within these walls, amidst the comfortable clutter of a life built together, the threads of Lindsay and Derek's marriage had begun to unravel. Life is peculiar, isn't it? A relentless current that pulls us along, sometimes gently, sometimes with a ferocious rush. We build our lives like castles of sand on its banks, fragile structures that feel solid until the tide shifts. Lindsay and Derek had constructed theirs with care, love, and laughter as the mortar between each stone. They first met in a small, charming bookstore when both reached for the same well-worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude. It had been a serendipitous moment, a story they often retold with a smile, a fate sealed by the scent of old pages and possibility. Now, those cherished memories felt like faded photographs, dulled by the inexorable march of time. What had once been a vibrant connection had settled into a pattern of routine, a steady rhythm that lulled them into quiet complacency. Beneath the calm, unseen threads of dissatisfaction were quietly fraying. In the kitchen, usually alive with the aromas of spices and the clatter of cooking, a stillness hung thick in the air. Lindsay moved through her motions with a practiced efficiency, her auburn hair hastily tied in a messy bun, her thoughts far away. She chopped vegetables with mechanical precision, each slice a symbol of the monotony her life had become. She had achieved her long-desired promotion to senior marketing executive, a milestone she had sacrificed sleep and weekends for, but it felt hollow, like a trophy for a race she no longer cared to run. Another day, another deadline, she muttered under her breath, the words leaving a bitter residue on her tongue. Her dreams of creative pursuits and globe-trotting adventures now felt as distant as a far-off horizon. Her gaze wandered to the framed photos lining the counter. Snapshots of her and Derek in their younger, carefree days, eyes bright with passion and possibility. That spark seemed a lifetime away. A soft sigh escaped her as the pan on the stove hissed gently, steam rising in curling wisps like the restless shapes of her thoughts. Her eyes flicked to the clock, its steady ticking a relentless reminder of time slipping away. She longed for Derek's familiar presence, the easy comfort of his smile. Yet even that comfort now felt thin, like a worn-out blanket, offering the illusion of warmth but little real solace. The front door creaked open, and Derek entered, his shoulders weighed down by weariness. He shrugged off his coat with slow, deliberate movements. His eyes, filled with tenderness, also held the fatigue of long, unspoken burdens. He was a man of quiet precision, a software engineer steeped in logic and method, with a kindness Lindsay had once adored. Now, that very stillness seemed emblematic of the inertia that had settled over their life together. "Hey," he greeted softly, his voice a low rumble. "Hey," she answered, her tone flat, her mind preoccupied. As he passed, their bodies brushed lightly, a fleeting touch, distant and almost impersonal. The moment was brief, but it spoke volumes about the growing chasm between them. They sat down to dinner, their conversation a thin veil of small talk that did little to conceal the emotional gulf. "How was work?" she asked, polite but detached. "The same. More bugs, more code," he replied, eyes on his plate. Their words circled the mundane, the day's events, the weather, but it was a hollow exchange, a pattern of politeness masking the depth of their disconnection. Later that evening, her phone buzzed, a welcome interruption in the sea of quiet dissatisfaction. It was Danny, her younger sister, her confidant, her best friend. Their bond, forged in the fires of childhood joys and heartaches alike, had weathered the years unbroken. Danny was her mirror, her voice of reason, the one person who always listened when the world felt too heavy. "Hey, sis!" Danny's cheerful voice chimed through the speaker, instantly lifting Lindsay's spirits. "Hey, you!" Lindsay replied, a smile tugging at her lips. They exchanged pleasantries, laughing at the latest family drama and sharing gossip about mutual friends, their voices weaving together in the familiar melody of sisterly banter. Yet beneath the surface of her laughter, Lindsay felt a gnawing unease she couldn't shake. "So, how's married life?" Danny teased. Lindsay hesitated, her smile faltering. "It's fine," she said, the word landing flat, unconvincing even to her own ears. Danny, ever perceptive, caught the shift in her tone. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice softening. Lindsay sighed, her eyes drifting to a photo on the nightstand, an echo of happier days. "It's just, I don't know, Danny. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice." Danny remained silent, her listening presence an invitation for Lindsay to continue. "Derek's a good man," Lindsay began, her voice carrying a bitter undercurrent, "but he's different now. He's not the man I fell in love with." Danny waited, her silence a comforting space for Lindsay's tangled thoughts. "He's become so predictable," Lindsay said, her words sharper than she intended. "He's happy with the same old routine, with our safe, small life, and I feel trapped." "Trapped," Danny echoed, her concern evident. Lindsay nodded, her voice dropping to a whisper as tears welled in her eyes. "Yeah, like I'm living someone else's life. If I had to do it all over again, I don't think I'd choose him. Not this version of him." The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, each syllable a crack in the foundation of her marriage. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but now that the truth was out, there was no taking it back. Unbeknownst to Lindsay, Derek had stepped into the kitchen, a steaming cup of tea in hand. He stopped cold in the doorway, her words cutting through him with the precision of a blade. The tea trembled in his grip as he stood rooted to the spot, his heart shattering in silent agony. He had always believed himself her anchor, her protector. Hearing her discontent laid bare, he felt the ground beneath him shift. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, to make her see the pain her confession had caused, but the words lodged in his throat, smothered by the weight of his grief. Quietly, he retreated. He set the cup on the counter with a soft clink, the sound reverberating like a cruel echo in the silence. His steps were heavy as he crossed the room, each movement deliberate, as though carrying the weight of a lifetime. The front door creaked open, then closed behind him with a muted finality. The silence that followed was suffocating, louder than any argument. It was the silence of a love laid bare and broken, the silence of a man who had walked out without a fight because the truth had already defeated him. Lindsay, oblivious, continued her conversation with Danny, her heart lighter for having spoken her truth. She didn't hear the door close or notice the empty space where Derek had stood. It wasn't until later, when she returned to the kitchen and found the abandoned cup of tea, now cold, that a strange emptiness settled over her. She stared at the door, irritation flickering briefly. Honestly, he's probably just sulking, playing the martyr, she thought, shaking her head. She went to bed that night, assuming Derek was simply in another room, indulging in his usual late-night coding sessions. But the emptiness beside her felt wrong, a sensation that clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with unanswered questions and lingering doubts. When morning came, sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting the room in pale gold. Lindsay reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against the cold, untouched side of the bed. A chill settled in her chest as unease tightened its grip. Rising slowly, her bare feet sank into the carpet as she made her way toward the living room, the oppressive silence of the house wrapping around her like a heavy fog. Something was wrong. Derek's side of the closet was empty. His shoes were gone from the entryway. Even his toothbrush had vanished from the bathroom. A knot of panic coiled in her stomach. Her breath quickened as fear and anger warred within her. "Where is he?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she typed out a text, masking her concern with casualness. "Hey, are you okay? Where are you?" Time dragged. Seconds became minutes, each one a reminder of his absence. She called him, her voice strained with desperation, but no one answered. Every unanswered ring amplified the silence. Irritation flared, fueled by the stubborn pride that refused to acknowledge her fear. "Fine," she muttered through gritted teeth. "If he wants to sulk, that's his choice." But pride couldn't fill the hollow space he'd left behind. Hours stretched into days filled with frantic messages, endless phone calls, and mounting dread. No one had seen him, not his friends, not his coworkers, not even his family. Lindsay retraced the steps of their life together, visiting the cafe where they'd had their first date, the bookstore where their hands had accidentally brushed. Everywhere she went, Derek remained a ghost, just out of reach. The weight of his absence pressed heavier with each passing day. Memories that once comforted her now felt like knives cutting into old wounds. She stared at photographs of him, her fingers lingering over his familiar smile, remembering the warmth of his embrace. Regret gnawed at her insides as she questioned every word, every choice that had led them here. Desperation drove her to places she'd never thought she'd go. She pored over their bank statements, searching for a clue. Her heart leapt when she found it, an unfamiliar hotel charge. Relief coursed through her veins, only to be replaced by anger. He was hiding? Avoiding her? So that's how you want to play? She muttered darkly. Fine, I'll play too. Guilt twisted with defiance as she grabbed her keys. She wanted to apologize, to take back the words that had cut him so deeply. But another part of her, the part still wounded and proud, longed for him to come crawling back. When she called the hotel, her urgency barely masked. The receptionist's polite refusal only stoked her fury. Privacy policies. Rules. Barriers. This is ridiculous, she snapped as she ended the call. He's my husband. I'm not some stalker. The drive to the hotel was a blur of red lights and clenched fists, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and rage. She stormed inside, her heels clicking with purpose, her mind rehearsing the words that would bring him home. At the front desk, she leaned in, her eyes burning with determination. I need to see my husband, Derek Harrison. He's staying here. The receptionist met her gaze with professional detachment. I'm sorry, ma'am. We can't disclose guest information. Lindsay's pulse roared in her ears. You don't understand, she said, her voice sharp with desperation. He's my husband. The polite smile remained fixed, unyielding as a wall. Frustration bubbled over. Her voice rose, trembling with emotion, an eruption of pain, pride, and fear finally unleashed. He's my husband, she repeated, her voice trembling with desperation. I need to see him. It's important. The receptionist remained unfazed, her polite demeanor as impenetrable as the marble countertop. Defeated, Lindsay turned away, her shoulders slumped in resignation. She made her way back to her car, her thoughts weighed down by despair. Every effort to reach Derek had been thwarted by a wall of silence and unyielding rules. Sitting in the parking lot, she stared blankly at the hotel. Emotions surged within her, a volatile storm of anger, fear, and regret. Fear now eclipsed her frustration, a deep and gnawing dread that she had gone too far, that this time she might have truly lost him. Her mind replayed the words that had sparked the unraveling. A chill coursed down her spine as she questioned herself. Had she really been so cold, so selfish? Could she truly have hurt him so profoundly? The answers hung in the air, damning in their silence. And then, unexpectedly, he was there. The familiar click of a key turning in the lock sent a jolt through her. The front door creaked open, a sound that had once brought comfort, but now stirred nothing but dread. Derek stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the living room. His face was unreadable, his features sharper, his presence distant. A coldness lingered in his gaze, a chill that gripped her heart. He moved with a slow deliberation, setting his bag down by the couch without a word. His silence screamed louder than any argument. Derek? She whispered, her heart hammering against her ribcage. Finally, he looked at her, his expression icy. We need to talk, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. What followed was not a fight. It wasn't the heated exchange she had feared or hoped for. It was a conversation stripped bare, raw and brutal in its honesty. Why did you leave? She asked, her voice trembling. I needed space, he replied, his tone as cold and vast as a winter sea. I needed to think, to process what I heard. It was just something I said, she stammered, forcing a nervous laugh. I didn't mean it. He raised an eyebrow, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Didn't mean it? He repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. You confessed to your sister that you'd rather not be with me? And that's just something you said? She faltered, scrambling for a defense that felt hollow even as she spoke it. I was upset. I didn't think you'd hear. He continued to stare. Disappointment etched into every line of his face. His voice dropped to a near whisper. I've always tried to be a good husband to you, Lindsay. I gave you my best, and all I ever got back was criticism and dissatisfaction. Nothing I did was ever enough. Her pride reared its head. She felt cornered, her frustration boiling over into cruel words she couldn't take back. You're not the man I married, she burst out, her voice rising. You've gotten lazy. You don't even try anymore. The moment the words left her mouth, she knew they had crossed a line. She saw the pain flicker in his eyes before the stillness overtook him, a quiet, resolute calm that chilled her more than any fury. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice low, his words deliberate. "You think I'm lazy and pathetic, and that's why you don't want to be with me?" "No," she backtracked, panic creeping into her voice. "That's not what I meant. I just I just said that if I had to do it all over again, I might have made a different choice." The words hung between them, sharp and unforgiving. "And what do you think I hear when you say that?" he asked, his voice trembling with a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "You're telling me I'm not good enough, that I'm a mistake, that you'd rather be with anyone else." The truth hit her like a sharp blade, cold, unforgiving, and final. In that moment, Lindsay realized with devastating clarity that she had pushed him too far, shattered something that might never be whole again. Derek's voice was steady but unyielding. "I can't keep doing this, Lindsay," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "I can't keep proving my worth to someone who refuses to see it. I deserve better, and I won't settle for less." The words struck her with the force of a blow, leaving her breathless. Her eyes widened, and panic clawed at her chest as the full weight of her actions pressed down on her. She wanted to argue, to explain, to make him understand that she hadn't meant to hurt him. But her voice betrayed her, leaving her silent and helpless. What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice trembling, heart thundering in her chest. "I'm saying I need more," he replied, his gaze steady, unwavering. "And if you're not willing to work on this, then maybe I shouldn't be here at all." Without another word, he turned, lifted his bag, and walked toward the door. The quiet click of his footsteps echoed through the room, each step pulling him further from her. Lindsay stood frozen, stunned and shattered, as her world crumbled around her. She had braced for a fight, for raised voices and raw emotion. But this calm, deliberate act of self-preservation felt far more devastating. He didn't slam the door. He didn't yell. He simply closed it softly behind him, leaving her alone to confront the wreckage of their broken relationship. The silence that followed was deafening, the finality of it suffocating. In the days that followed, life became a hollow blur. The house felt colder, emptier. Each quiet room became a painful monument to his absence. She wandered aimlessly, her fingers trailing over the remnants of his presence, the coat still hanging in the hallway, the half-filled coffee mug that had long since gone cold. Every touch summoned memories that twisted the knife deeper into her chest. She reached out, sent messages filled with tentative hope and aching regret. "Are you okay? Can we talk?" His replies, when they came, were distant, polite, devoid of warmth. Each brief response chipped away at her hope. He had moved on. Or perhaps, she thought bitterly, he was never looking back. Danny became her anchor. Her sister's steady presence kept her from spiraling completely. She listened, offered words of comfort, a shoulder to cry on, but even Danny couldn't erase the gnawing emptiness. Every photograph Lindsay stared at, every tear that streaked her face, was a reminder of her own failures. She had taken Derek for granted. She had let routine and resentment consume them. Now she was paying the price. Love, she realized too late, wasn't just about passion and thrill. It was about respect, about open-hearted communication, about finding joy in the everyday moments of togetherness. She had forgotten that truth. And now, the consequences felt unbearable. The weekend arrived, and with it, the inevitable reckoning. Derek was coming to collect his things. The very thought of seeing him again filled her with dread. She busied herself with meaningless tasks, trying to erase the signs of their shared life. But it was impossible. The house was saturated with memories. Every corner, every object, whispered his name. The closet felt cavernous with his side empty. The bed, once a place of warmth and comfort, now seemed vast and cold. Even the shoe rack by the door felt like a silent, mournful testimony to his absence. When the doorbell rang, her pulse spiked. She smoothed her dress with trembling hands, inhaling deeply to steady her nerves. Derek stood on the other side, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. He wore a tailored jacket, sleek, confident, and unfamiliar. He had changed, she thought with a pang of sadness and admiration. There was a new air of certainty in the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that both intimidated and drew her in. She opened the door, her heart pounding like a drumbeat of regret. He didn't smile. He didn't hug her. He didn't even glance in her direction. Derek walked past her, his footsteps deliberate, heading straight to the bedroom. He began packing his belongings into cardboard boxes with a calm, practiced precision. She followed him, her heart heavy with desperation, her voice fragile with longing. "Derek," she whispered, her words trembling in the air, "can we talk?" He paused, a bundle of neatly folded clothes in his hands, his eyes fixed on the task in front of him. "About what?" His tone was distant, devoid of warmth. "About us," she pleaded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "About everything that's happened." He sighed, placing the clothes aside before turning to face her. His expression carried a weariness that bordered on pity. "Lindsay," he said softly, "you've already made it clear how you feel. It's too late." She opened her mouth to explain, to justify her actions, but every excuse sounded empty, even to herself. He shook his head, his face unmoved by her attempts. "It's not just about that one argument," he continued, his voice gathering quiet strength. "It's everything. The way you speak to me, the way you treat me, it's as if I'm never enough for you." The truth hit her like a slap, and she winced under the weight of it. He was right. She had pushed him too far, fractured something that words alone could never mend. She cried, begged, grasped for a way to undo the damage. But her tears fell into the silence between them, powerless to soften his resolve. His hands moved steadily, folding shirts, packing memories into boxes, each motion deliberate and final. "So this is it?" she choked, her voice cracking as her tears spilled over. "You're just giving up on us?" He met her gaze, his eyes a mixture of sorrow and determination. "I'm not giving up on us," he said firmly. "I'm choosing myself. I'm done trying to prove my worth to someone who refuses to see it." His words rang out, sharp and unrelenting, the final verdict on their unraveling love. He left without another glance, leaving her amid the ruins of a life they had built together. The door closed softly behind him, but the sound reverberated like a thunderclap in the hollow spaces of her heart. The silence grew heavier, the house colder, its emptiness suffocating. In the weeks that followed, Lindsay's life blurred into a haze of sorrow and regret. She threw herself into work, burying her pain in endless tasks and sterile deadlines. But the ache of his absence followed her everywhere. Everywhere she turned, she saw reminders of him. The unfinished canvas in the living room, a symbol of dreams they once shared. She stared at it, imagining the future they could have had if only she had been more attentive, more grateful, more present. But imagination couldn't undo reality. She learned to cook alone, to sleep in a bed stripped of warmth, to navigate a world where his love no longer existed to guide her. The journey was brutal, a relentless confrontation with her flaws and selfishness, forcing her into a painful reckoning with herself. A month later, she sat in a quiet coffee shop, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, her mind a battlefield of memories. And then she saw him. Derek sat at a table across the room, laughing with a woman whose presence seemed to radiate light. Their smiles were effortless, their conversation animated and warm. Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. Her chest tightened with a sharp pang of jealousy and regret. He looked happy, happier than he had been in years. Her eyes drifted to the woman. She was beautiful, her elegance natural and unassuming. There was a grace in her gestures, a warmth in her laughter, a lightness that seemed to fill the air around her. Lindsay's heart ached with shame. She remembered all the ways she had torn him down, belittled his efforts, dismissed his feelings. In that moment, she felt small, insignificant, as though her presence had been a weight he had finally shed. She lowered her gaze, her shame burning hotter than her regret. She wanted to walk over, to interrupt their laughter, to insert herself into the joy that was no longer hers. She wanted to remind him of their shared past, of moments filled with promises and dreams, but shame rooted her to the ground, an invisible weight that held her back. She had no right. Her choices had carved this path, and now she was left to endure the consequences alone. Then he saw her. For the briefest second, their eyes met. His easy smile faltered, a flicker of recognition that was quickly buried beneath a calm indifference. He nodded in her direction, a polite, distant acknowledgement, before turning back to the woman beside him. In his mind, she had already become just another passerby, a shadow of someone he used to know. It was in that fleeting moment, watching him share a happiness she was no longer part of, that the truth finally broke through her. She felt the sharp ache of realization. This was her loss, carved by her own hands. She had driven him away, crushed the tenderness he offered, and now he had moved on. His life no longer touched hers. The air felt heavier as Lindsay turned and stepped outside, her breath shallow and her heart laden with sorrow. Every step she took down the street echoed with the weight of regret. She had learned a bitter truth, that love was as fragile as the silences between words, that pride could build walls where trust should stand, and that the smallest unspoken moments often bore the loudest consequences. With her head bowed, her feet moved slowly over the pavement, her mind chasing shadows of the past. She couldn't undo the harm she had done. She couldn't rewrite history. But she could choose differently now. A new path lay before her, one where she would cherish love as a living, breathing force. She would listen with empathy. She would speak her heart's truth, not with harsh judgments, but with warmth and vulnerability. The old house awaited her return, its creaking boards and faded paint a silent testament to stories left unfinished. Its wide porch seemed to sigh with the stillness of things left unsaid. Yet it was no longer a prison of memories. It was an empty canvas, waiting for her to paint it anew. And so, Lindsay stood at its threshold, her heart heavy yet hopeful. She would carry her regret as a reminder, a scar that would guide her to become more. She had a long road ahead, but with each step she would rewrite her story. She would fill the empty spaces with words of kindness, actions of love, and a newfound humility. And maybe one day, she would find the courage to forgive herself.